Welcome to Pullback, the podcast that explores big new ideas and asks, is this a real solution or a distraction? On our regularly scheduled seasons, we talk to experts about all of the different cool ways that we could fix society, from climate change to like social inequality. But we're between seasons now, which means that we're doing book reports.
But for those of you who may have been listening to, it's been a little while since we did a proper season, and fear not, we are actually working on season 3 now. So episodes will be in your ears at some point in fall. We're hoping September. But yeah, we're not just interminably going to be discussing books.
Although, I mean, this is a book podcast now suddenly. No, we've scheduled, I think, 3 or 4 interviews. We like to have 10 for a season. So we're cooking along. We're recording our first episode on Friday of this week. So it's happening, listeners. But before then, Kristen assigned me a science book to read.
Neither of us are in our wheelhouse with this one, but it was fun.
It was so good. So the book that Kristen chose for this episode was An Immense World by Ed Yong, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on COVID for The Atlantic. So that's kind of cool. Seems like a really cool science journalist. And he has written a book about the many different ways that the creatures that we share our planet with experience things, you know, and it's deeply scientific in a way that, like, I did go cross-eyed a couple of times and was like, I'm just gonna skip to the next paragraph. But for the most part, very accessible. And then he's really good at like metaphors and similes to be like, this is probably what it's like, but who knows?
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting book. So Kyla and I were choosing between 2 suggestions. One was this book, and another one was a book all about how many animals are killed by roads. And that one was just too much of a downer even for us. So we read some bat facts.
Yeah, I will say I did end up listening to Crossings, and it made me very angry and sad, but also really well researched, very well written. If you already hate cars like I do, then maybe it's a good book to read. If you don't hate cars, you should, and this is a good book to get you there. So
it's horrifying. We may do an episode on road ecology at some point because
there's a lot there.
Yeah.
It might be one of the books that I read this year where I like learned the most, but I was upset about everything I learned. Whereas with An Immense World, I learned a lot, but I still knew like the broad strokes of like the more exciting animals that he talks about. Like I knew that dolphins use echolocation, but I didn't know that they can use it to see the inside of my squishy little body.
Yeah. And I didn't know that humans could echolocate. I definitely learned that.
Oh, yeah. That was cool. There's like a whole section where the author goes around with a person who's blind essentially since birth. And like he uses clicks to kind of paint the world around him. And it's really cool. It's really cool. This whole book ruled. I would say 90% of the cool stuff it talks about is about insects, which is good for me because I'm a bit of an insectophobe. So I'm like much more like I'm going to be looking more warmly at like all of the insects around me now, but also like great chapters on alligators, crocodiles, whales, dolphins, naked mole rats,
bats, eels.
Yeah. So basically this book, and I think very clever, like it was just so cleverly put together, but it's just a series of chapters that are basically like the different senses that creatures have. And humans are missing like a bunch of them, but we have a bunch of senses. So it's kind of interesting, especially when you're talking about like smell or eyesight or touch. And he's like, okay, so this is how it works with humans. Now get ready to have your mind blown because because it turns out clams have 100 or 200 eyeballs that are just like motion sensors and like it's so weird.
Yeah, I really liked the idea too. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk more about like the details of the different senses, but there's sort of like a unifying concept that the author brings forward to organize the book. And it's this concept called the Umwelt, which is basically just the universe that is available to us through our perception. So the main point of the book is basically just humility, that there are a whole bunch of different ways that animals perceive, many of which like we can kind of put ourselves in their head to some extent, but for some of them it's very difficult to understand how they would perceive the world. And just to kind of think about the ways in which we assume sort of like a really vision centric umwelt that is not necessarily the case for a lot of animals. And a lot of the world that we've built, we don't realize that we're sort of like polluting the environment for animals because they perceive things in different ways. And, we might really be messing with the way that they hear things or see things, or echolocate or electrolocate, which is a thing I'd never heard of before, but it's very cool.
Yeah, that was really cool. Because he talks about electric eels a bunch. And I was like, oh yeah, it is weird that some fish can electrocute you. Why is that? What is that for? And it turns out it's so that they can see around them. And it's like, what? And the way that like birds will change their pitch in just like the tiniest ways to like, it's like everything around us is talking to each other, and humans have had the audacity for however many hundreds of years, thousands of years, depending on what cultures you're from, to be like, no, we're the only ones with language. And it's like, no, everybody's talking to each other.
Yeah, it's so true. So we've assumed that animals don't have these capacities because their umwelt in some ways is different. And we're not like looking at the things that they're doing. One really good example from the book of that is it's in the echolocation chapter, I think. And it's where the author's talking to somebody who deals with elephants. And the elephant sort of like enclosure person realizes that these two elephants have been talking to each other through like foot stamps, I think. And they're sort of like feeling the vibrations. And they've been doing that like across a fence. And it's something that like that person would not have noticed. But they just happened to in that one instance, and it like totally blew their mind, and a totally different way they're sensing.
Yeah, it's what I really liked about this book, because it was written like in 2022, I think. So it's like brand new. And so what I really liked is like a lot of the information that I was seeing in here is stuff that I was like, oh yeah, I know that like bats echolocate. But then he gave the history of like how humans even discovered that. And then like talked about up into the present day what we're still learning. And so I was like, oh, the Magic School Bus covered some of this, but there's a lot of nuance that we've learned since the 1990s that's really cool to get like brushed up on.
Yeah, the way that they learned that bats echolocate was a pretty like, I found that really interesting history. There was like a guy that pitched that bats echolocate, and he got like so made fun of in the scientific community in like the 1700s. They were like, what? You're proposing they see with their ears? This is nonsense. But yeah, he'd been doing these really cruel experiments that sort of like pointed to that. And now it's nice that like scientists seem to have much more robust ethics standards, although I'm sure we could sort of talk about like some of the harm that's done to animals in experimentation today. They're a lot more careful than they used to be. Like the scientists in the 1700s was like blinding bats and being like, go see if you can find food. It's like just completely barbaric. And now it's like, we'll put like a little hat on them or something.
Yeah, that was a really interesting part of the book, is the author really does show the history of like, this is what we thought 200 years ago. This is the experiments that we ran that were horrific to find out like that, this was true or not. And this is where we're at now. And it's crazy how much we still don't know. Some birds can like sense the magnetic pull of the North and South poles, which is already a little bit like mind boggling. But that whole chapter, they were like, we don't know how animals are doing this. And it seems like everybody but us can sense this. And I was like, what? There's no sensory organ for it. Like, we don't know. There's no way for us to turn that off. Like, it might be coming in at like we might need a better understanding of quantum physics to understand how birds can sense the magnetic pull of the earth. Like, everyone should run out and read this book. That's my take, first of all, to start with. But yeah, he very wisely starts with the sense of scent, So he can talk about dogs, which is really a great way to win everybody over right away. One of the really cool things about the scent chapter was that I learned was that snakes smell with their tongues. And the way that they like twist their tongue around is like making a vortex to like pull more air into their tongue receptors so that they can like sense the smells around them.
I just love that the way they found that out was that like some scientist was like, yeah, let's get some cornstarch in the air and we'll just film it. That's ingenious.
Yeah, and I liked that in a lot of cases the author did describe what experiments were used to get the results, but in a lot of cases he was like, they just do this, and I was like, what is the experiment? Like, how did we figure that out? Because this book can only be so long. But there were some things that it was like, oh yeah, we figured out that crocodiles have bumps all over their bodies and they're all basically like fingers that can sense like pressure and stuff. So like that's how they know that there's fish nearby. And I was like, what is the experiment? And so I would like sit there, I'd like pause reading to just be like, use my brain and be like, I wonder what they did to figure that out. Like trying to picture experiments is really fun too.
Yeah, I really liked how this book, I thought it was a super smart choice, as you said, to start with scent, because I think you can get everybody in the door with the dog point. And I think anyone that's owned a dog has thought to a certain extent about like the centrality of smell for their sort of umwelt. Maybe not in those terms, but like it's thought about like how much dogs love to sniff and how important it is to their communication. But even in that, there was like a lot that I didn't know that the book helped to sort of elucidate. And then like dogs are even like fairly similar to humans in some respects. I think it's like, I guess it was more on the site that they were similar, but like scent is used in such different ways by some creatures. And like, so like it's kind of easy for us to get an entry point with dogs, but then to realize that even in this sense that like we're pretty good at it. We don't use that sense very much. So, but we could, in theory, be trained to use it better if we wanted to. But there's like some animals that are, I mean, snakes are just out there vortexing the air. So they basically see with their tongues. Does it taste? Does it smell? It was unclear.
Yeah, and some of the facts about even just the dog scent blew my mind. Like, dogs can basically sniff into the past. And I mean, like, you can sniff into the past a little bit. Like, if someone farts and you can smell it 5 minutes later, that's like scent traveling through time. But dogs can do that for like hours, days, right? Like if a dog's sniffing a doorway, they can smell like everybody who stepped over that doorway in the last like 24 hours. And it's like, what?
Yeah, this idea that a dog is really like reading the newspaper when they sniff like a pee spot or whatever. I thought that was really charming.
Yeah. Like it's how they get to know the world around them, and in such a way that I couldn't even begin to imagine what a dog could be thinking when he smells something interesting on the ground, right? It's like, what does that look like in your brain? What knowledge are you gaining? I don't know, because my sense of smell is not near, like, I wouldn't be able to smell like the difference between a bomb and like a chocolate bar, but dogs can. I mean, actually, that's a bad example. I probably could, but I mean, not if the bomb is scented like chocolate.
You could ID the chocolate bar for sure.
Yeah. That was a bad example. I'm not the author.
I could not sniff out a tennis ball, though, for example, whereas a dog would have no trouble with that. I thought that was interesting too. Like, so he starts with the dogs and then he moves on to other animals. And I think this is kind of where we got like it was a first realization that was made like throughout the book, for me anyway, was this idea that like scent is actually like the dominant sense for a lot of animals. And he talked about ants as a really good example of this. Ants like will override their visual cues if like pheromones are saying that an ant is dead, for example. So there have been like live ants that smell dead that they'll just like carry into the like death chambers or whatever. I really don't understand ant societies.
No, that's the thing. Like, he talks about insects a lot, and ants, I think, were the first really interesting insect that came up. But yeah, I was like, what the ants are so weird. But also, we're making them smell dead, so they're not used to that. So they haven't like developed they're just like, this ant is dead, even though I'm not dead.
No, but it's like, I think it's a good example of like one of the things that I really came to realize, and I think it was like an explicit point of the book, is just we are so reliant on sight for everything. We're such a sight-based society. That's not how most animals are at all. And we're like among, other than like a couple of like birds that can see super well, we have among the best like acuity visually of any species. And so like that means that we just enter the world really ignoring all of our other senses that are like very central for some animals. I really liked in the sight chapter how they talked about bees basically seeing in pixels.
Oh, yeah. And also how bees can sense electromagnetically as well. And so like maybe and then he's so fun. This author does such a good job of being like, maybe some flowers have like grown into a shape that like it produces a certain electromagnetic field that bees are attracted to. But we can't know that because we can't sense the electromagnetic fields around us.
Yeah, that was another, I found it really interesting in the book too, like that question of like, in what direction did evolution happen? I had always taken for granted that it would be sort of bees evolving for the flowers. But he made a really strong case that like flowers were also sort of like designed to be attractive to the senses of different animals. And there was a bunch of similar points to that throughout the book, which was kind of cool.
Yeah, it was a really good way of pointing out how we're all connected. Anytime he was telling something really cool about a prey creature or like a bird of prey, even like it would be like, okay, so eagles have like this kind of eyesight and they can see this distance, but up close they're a little bit weird. And in the dark, they're no good. And so, because of that, the things that they prey on have evolved in this way, which means that then their other things that will eat those things have evolved in this way. And it's just like we're all living together, sharing this planet, and we're all just one giant ecosystem that is learning from itself. And I loved it.
Yeah, and also just like the ways that you can accomplish different goals through like different accumulations of senses. So, like some animals will really lean into the scent. Some of them will do sort of like visual combination, touch. Some of them will do like echolocation. Some of them will. I still don't really understand the electrolocation.
I don't think anyone does, from what I can tell. Apparently, I really liked. There was one scientist he was talking to, and he's like, "Yeah, when I found out the animals that I'm studying electromagnetize, they use like electromagnet." I was like, "Oh shit," because it's like it's really hard to study that apparently.
Which I can understand.
There's some really cool stuff about spiders in here. There's like one jumping spider that can like move its retinas without moving its head, which is really unusual for an insect.
Yeah, what was the deal with naked mole rats? I remember that was a big focus of the book, but I forget why.
I think that was in the touch section because their noses are basically like a million fingers. And so they're like using their noses as fingers to touch the world around them. Listen, guys, you just have to read this book. We're not.
Also, catfishes are just a giant tongue. Their entire skin is tongue. Just so you know. If you're tasting a catfish, it's tasting you too. Sorry, I'm done.
On the topic of marine life, whales can make noises loud enough to be heard across entire oceans. And it's like, are they using that to communicate, or is that just like a byproduct of how noisy they are? Like, we don't know.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the parts of this book that were like, scientist is right. Scientist's career is almost destroyed. Scientist is right.
Yes. That was a big one. That was a big one for the whales. I think that actually might be one of the first things I bookmarked here. He talks a lot about like seals and sea lions and how they use like their whiskers underwater and how they're shaped in just the right way to sense currents without like being thrown off by their own current. Animals are cool.
Yeah, I didn't expect to learn as much about like, I expected this to be a lot about animals. I didn't expect it to prompt as much introspection about like humanity as it did. But the echolocation, I want to talk about like the blind person who he talked to who has echolocated since he was little, because I thought that was a really interesting point. There's apparently a big debate in the blind community about echolocation, because on one hand, like as the guy that the author interviews in the book who can echolocate, he makes the point that like most parents will sort of discourage their blind children from learning skills like echolocation because they really want them to sort of fit into society, like the society that's really reliant on sight. And it like goes back to this sort of like sense of, you know, like paternalism over persons with disabilities. And so he's making the case that like essentially echolocation is a skill that should be taught and passed down by blind people. I really was persuaded by that point. But there's also like a raging debate among the community because apparently this may not be a capacity that like everybody who can't see can learn. And so like, I don't know, I just found that fascinating.
Yeah, no, there was a really this book was really good. I really liked that section too, because it really raises the idea of like, yeah, maybe your kid will look weird going to school just clicking their tongue really loudly constantly, and you as a parent who loves them want them to fit into society, but the society that we've built is maybe could stand to be more tolerant, and if somebody thinks it's weird, you know, like you explain what's going on, and maybe we should be in a space where someone's like, oh, actually that's really cool, and not you're weird and like push down some blind kid.
Yeah. I also thought that conversation was really interesting from the perspective of like showing even two people, like, I mean, one of the problems with the animal divide is they cannot describe to us what their existence is like because we don't share common language. But even the author trying to sort of engage with this blind guy that echolocates, they had a lot of trouble because there was a lot about this guy's experience that he couldn't really verbalize in a way that made sense to somebody who's like really reliant on sight. And so I thought that was really like, it was an interesting thing that there are like inherent boundaries that we all kind of really do perceive through our own umvelts, which like, I mean, another fact from this book is that there's no scent that is universally felt by humans to be pleasant or unpleasant. There's all kinds of differences, even among humans that have like all of the same senses. There's a lot of variation in what we see, you know, how our brains process it, how we smell, how our brains process that. And so, like, to a certain extent, we are all kind of in our own little, you know, bubbles. And it's hard to sort of empathize. Like, there are limits to how much we can empathize with even people who are very similar because, like, we have these different ways of perceiving and entering the world. But language was like really helpful. It was really interesting to hear the story of this echolocating guy. And he was kind of talking about things that I wouldn't have guessed. He's like, you know, I can't necessarily tell a plush toy from a champagne bottle on the table because for me, I'm just sensing this big table and like the things that are on it, they're hard for me to sort of perceive. And there are certain like ways that I had assumed echolocation worked because you kind of see those like depictions in cartoons and stuff. It's just these like lines extending. And that's how I had thought about it. But it's really like from this guy's experience, that's not really how he perceives it when he echolocates. And so like, what even is echolocation? You know?
Yeah. Well, and some bats get around that by they'll kind of go at different angles to see the shape of a bug on a leaf. So like maybe if he had bent over to the side of the table and like gone sideways, he could have, you know what I mean? Like it was very, very interesting. I was actually surprised by there was only he did include the obligatory chapter at the very end where it was like, hey, it's the Anthropocene, and many of these really cool animals that we've learned about over the last 400 pages are going extinct or are already extinct, or like think of all of the umwelt that we're not going to ever be able to even try to perceive because we're destroying the planet. So maybe we should take care of that. But even that was like, if anybody is listening to this, which would be weird, we're very much a climate change discussion podcast. But if you're like, no, I don't want to read a book that's all about animals and climate change, this is great. This is a book that is 90% cool facts about animals. And then at the very end, it's like, okay, now all of those cool things that we've learned, think about how the society that we've created could be harming them. Like Kristen said earlier, our lights are the wrong shade for like migrating birds and like all of these things you wouldn't have even thought about. I mean, I don't know how much of Crossings you've read, Kristen, but there's a whole section about the monarch butterflies and roads. And it's like, like the world that we are creating is for us, and it's very selfish and like a little solipsistic. Like we just aren't taking into account that the creatures around us are experiencing a very rich inner life, and maybe we should.
Yeah. And like that the side effect of sort of the Anthropocene and building the world around human needs is that we're shaping biodiversity in ways that mean the animals with more similar umvelts to our own are going to be the ones that are most likely to survive. I thought it was a really good way to sort of end a book where you've sort of like your perspective is opened up throughout the entire book, and he sort of hits it home. But you're right, it's not like that's the whole experience of the book. It's just that's sort of like the final chapter, that maybe we take away all these fun animal facts and think about like what it means for thinking about noise pollution, thinking about how fast our ships can go, things like that.
Yeah, and he does fill the book with some really interesting ways that we could make our world better for the creatures around us. And I found myself, I don't know what kind of, introspection you were having while you were reading this book, but I found myself a bunch of times just being like, man, we are so excited by the idea of life on another planet, when there is life all over this planet that we haven't even discovered yet, if we go into the deep oceans, and that we can't even begin to understand some of the ways that they are sensing the world around them. Like our planet is full of fascinating, interesting, intelligent life that's different from our experience as people. Why would a microbe on Mars be more valuable than all of the really cool dragonflies and insects that are vanishing from the planet? Like, when was the last time you went for a road trip and had a windshield full of bugs? Like, he actually, I think this was in Crossings, but he was like, oh yeah, the aerodynamics of a car have changed, but it's like not by that much, like we can see the bugs disappearing. And yet, if we discovered life on another planet, it would be probably microbial, and we would go out of our way to like study it and keep it safe. And it's like, we have so much cool stuff here, guys.
It's an immense world, to use the title of the book.
So I kept thinking about that. I just was like, we as a species, we get so excited about the possibility of life on other planets while we ignore the life that is teeming under our feet, that is fascinating.
And like, I don't know, I feel like kids have sort of like an inherent sense of wonder about the world, and we kind of like train that out of ourselves over time. But the more we think about the complex umwelt of the animals around us, I think the more it sort of reminds us that we live in this it's a really cool existence that we have,
It is. Yeah, and it's kind of really cool to be a person, because like a few times I was reading the book and I was like, oh, I'm kind of sad that I'll never experience this sense that these animals have that seems really cool. But then I was like, and he says this in the book too, I think, like, how cool is it that I get to be the species that can even try to imagine what other species are going through? I think this was near the end of the book, where he was like, our superpower is that we can empathize in a way with the creatures around us that, the dragonfly has no idea about, like an eagle, because eagles don't really eat dragonflies, probably, unless there's, I don't know, a shortage of mice. I'm not a scientist, but like their umwelt is only, it takes in the predators that they need to worry about, the mates that they want to find, and the food that they need to eat. And everything else is just kind of like secondary or non-existent. Like, they don't know about the sea turtles on the other side of the world, but we get to know all that stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I I like the idea of empathy as the thing that sort of like defines our species. Because I mean, I certainly is not something that is a dominant characteristic of humans always. But wouldn't it be nice if it was? Wouldn't we have a beautiful world if we really leaned into the empathy that we're capable of? Just for all the dog owners out there, your dogs can't see your balls. Like, I'm going to phrase that a different way. For all the dog owners out there, the dog cannot see the ball when you throw it. They do not see red and oranges very well. They see them as like green or brown, so they look exactly like the grass. That is why they can't find the ball. Get them a blue one.
Oh, that's perfect. Do we have any final thoughts that we want to share on this book?
Do you have a favorite animal fun fact from the book?
Yeah, as expected, the fact that crocodiles are covered in buttons. I can sense everything around them in like the most sensitive way. You know, there was another one where, oh man, there were so many, Kristen. There was another one where like whales and mammal fish probably like at one point lived on land and then went back to the water, and then you've got a bunch of animals that like lived in water and then went back to the land. Then went back. It was just he talks about evolution in like such a cool way where I was like, oh, like that is like the history of all of these animals. We're so focused on our own history that I think, you know, a big part of what made this book really cool is like, here's the history that we think could possibly be true of like bats or whales, but we don't know because we haven't like invested enough research into them. But maybe if we did, we could learn as much about their history as we know about our own. And wouldn't that be cool?
Oh, that would be really nice. Yeah, I think mine was probably the cornstarch snake thing, but
it's pretty good.
It's pretty good.
The whole chapter on bats just made me so happy because I was like, oh, I know all about echolocation. I've always loved bats. But even as an aficionado, I learned so much and it was so fun to read about it. And I loved how he was talking to scientists through this entire book, and the scientists like obviously care about their subjects. And so there was like, was it like a sea lion where they were like, oh yeah, we could test them to do like this really cool thing. And this lion was better at it than this other one, but we think it's because the other one he gets bored easy.
Relatable.
It's like, yeah, all of these like test subjects that these scientists are working with, they have personalities and they're unique. And like, I'm not sad enough about climate change, but it makes me so sad because it's like, everything around us is experiencing the world probably as robustly as we are, if not more.
It might be like a little bit fuzzier for some of them, but
I mean, maybe. I think what makes us maybe a little bit unique, apart from obviously our wonderful empathy in some of us, is also like our ability to like introspect. But whales have huge brains. They can probably do tons of introspection. I bet they're very self-aware. Like it's really hard to. He said this a couple of times, especially in the chapter on pain, where he was like, "There's no test that like proves consciousness. You just have to like everybody is just conscious, and then whatever their internal experiences are like, we don't know. You know?
Yeah, and I mean, I also thought it was interesting. There was something in the whales chapter where he was talking about time scales. And I thought that was interesting too. Like the time scale on which different animals are perceiving and communicating is different for us than for others. And that was like an element of it I had never really thought about. But it's kind of a nice idea because I've always kind of thought of trees as sort of operating on much longer time scales. But like it's nice to think about some animals as like the slow, long living ones, you know, and that just feels right for whales, you know?
Yeah. He even had in one of his like notes at the bottom of a page, it was like in Finding Nemo, when Dory there's a running joke with that she just speaks really slowly when she's talking whale. And he's like, that might actually just be accurate. It was so good. He was very funny, very engaging. Even some of the drier stuff, it's very few and far between. And once you get through it, it's always like to make a really interesting point.
Yeah, it made me think, it made me feel, it made me delighted with animal facts.
Yeah, I think this is going to be this might be my second favorite nonfiction book of the year. We still have like 5 months left, and I'm reading a wild amount of books this year. But so far, this one's number 2, and I think it might stay that way. It's really good.
What's number 1 right now? Is it Less is More?
It's the 1619 Project. It's really good. It tells the story. It's an American history book, which is extremely not my wheelhouse. I do not like to read American history. I think it's boring and I have no say in it anyways. So like, boo. But it's the American history from the perspective. It like centers the institution of slavery in the narrative of like where the United States started and where it's at today. And it just frames everything about the United States around that.
I think there's a podcast series of it too, isn't it?
Maybe. I know that the New York Times in 2019 put out the 1619 Project, and then they wrote a book about it a couple of years later. And so now I'm reading that. And it's really good. It's really good. I don't think I'll read a better nonfiction book this year. And I'm not even done yet. I still have like, I don't know, 100 pages left, but it's big and I'm almost done. I'll finish it like tonight.
Incredible.
Yeah. What about you? You got any best books of the year so far?
Ooh, that's a really tough one.
Chain Gang All-Stars?
It was a good book, yeah.
I think Chain Gang All-Stars is going to be my best fiction book of the year. If I'm picking now, 1619 for nonfiction, Chain Gang for fiction, and then runner-up for nonfiction is An Immense World. It was really good. Thank you for choosing this book.
Yeah, I thought it's a book that I've wanted to read for a little while because it just sounded so fun and so like informative, and it nailed it on both of those things. Maybe it's one of my favorite ones that I've read this year. I'm reading The Big Con right now, but it's not as good as this one, I don't think. It's a book about consulting firms and the history of consulting. So, it's interesting, but it's not as good. I'll just do a plug for Thomas Piketty. I finished Capital and Ideology after... It was a very long process. It took me months, but it was like a 48-hour audiobook. So
yeah, I was just about to start that one. And then I was like, oh, it's 48 hours. So I've tagged it to come back to.
Yeah, it's a bit, I think you might find it a bit on the dry side.
That's fine. I listen on 3 times speed, so.
Yeah, it's an extremely detailed look at how inequality has been justified over centuries in different societies. So it was really good. I'm glad I read it. But yeah, it's a slog. A Brief History of Equality might be a better one. It's a little bit shorter and lighter.
Yeah, I think I'm on hold for that one. I have so many books. I'm on hold for 13 books right now, and I have 6 on my shelf. But I'll be done these 6 by the end of the week, so that'll be fine.
But yeah, Age of Insecurity was great. I think that was this year still. Oh, I'm going to tag that one as my best one. I think Age of Insecurity. Yeah.
All right, well, thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you soon.